Okay, my name is Dr. Ann Bowles. I'm a senior research scientist at Hubbs-SeaWorld Research Institute, and I direct the Animal Behavior and Census program here. I got my PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, what seems a long time ago now, and I got my undergraduate degree at UCSD. I actually started out as a linguist and then discovered that I'd much rather work on animal communication. So I shifted over in my graduate career, and now I do bioacoustics, which is the study of animal sound perception and sound production. What I want to talk to you about is something that we work on that's very practical. Our goal is to use information about how animals perceive sound to understand what might be happening to them under the surface of the water. When you look out over the ocean, you see a flat surface. But for animals, what's happening in the ocean is what's underneath. And that means that anytime a person puts something in the water, animals may interact with it. For example, if you put in a pot to catch lobsters, there's going to be a float at the surface and a line on the bottom, but there's the line in the water, and animals can get all wrapped up in it. So what we're interested in is ways, and it isn't just fishing gear, it's anything we put in the water, because there's garbage, there's stuff that we use to anchor ships, everything is a potential source of interaction with animals. And what we want to do is understand that to the point where we can design gear that's safe for them. So that's what I want to talk about today. So over the years, people have said, well, one easy way of keeping animals out of gear is to warn them, create an alarm. So this is an alarm. This is a net alarm, and the idea is that it makes a little peep, and that sound is supposed to tell the animal that something's coming. Makes a lot of sense, right, if you just think about it? But think about it from the perspective of the animal. Here you are swimming through the water. You can't see very far ahead because in water your visibility isn't anything like it is in air. You're dependent upon sound as a source of information underwater, and that's why we're so fascinated with sound. So what do you hear? I'm going to play this thing. Now be aware that I can't hear this anymore. So that's one important principle, is if you can't hear something, then it doesn't do you any good as an alarm. All right, so I'm betting that this sound will be audible to people who are under the age of 30. We'll see. You can tell me afterwards if you heard it. It produces a little tiny ping. We know from the work that we've done on hearing in animals, that's mostly been done in the oceanarium environment, because you have to be able to train the animal to tell you if they can hear it or not. When we do that, we find out, yes, in fact, they can hear this little high-pitched peep. And we've done a bunch of experiments with animals showing that, in fact, not only can they hear it, but some of them don't particularly want to have to listen to it. So it turns out that one of the ways that these alarms work is not by telling them that something bad is out there, but actually by making a sound that they'd rather not be anywhere near. So that's an important thing to know, because that means that you need to be careful about where these sounds are projected. The second thing is you have to ask, does it actually work? And it turns out that as long as you are in open water, it works great. But if you're in a confined space where the animal doesn't have much choice, it's not telling them that there's danger there, it's telling them that there's an obnoxious noise. So this is the kind of things that you can only figure out if you actually have the animal's involvement. You ask them to tell you the answer to the question. So that's, to me, that's one of the most important aspects of what we do, is seeing the world from the animal's point of view.
What type of animals have you worked with these sound devices?
Well, actually, that's one of the cool things, is that there are a lot of differences between different species and how they approach things that go into the water. So it isn't just that individual animals have personalities, it's also that different species have different ways of coping with the challenges of being in nature. So if you're a little tiny shy animal, the ones that we worked on are commerson's dolphins. There are a lot of other little dolphins, harbor porpoises out there in the ocean. that are at the bottom of the food chain, and for them, being conservative and avoiding anything that might even vaguely be dangerous is a good thing. So those guys avoid these sounds, and they avoid them over and over and over and over again, to the point where we go, well, it's really not fair at this point to ask the animal to tolerate it. So that's why for those guys, you want to make sure that they're not being exposed in an area that they absolutely have to have for their survival. Now, if you're a great big bottlenose dolphin used to asserting yourself, you swim up to it really fast, and maybe the way that you get yourself into trouble is by getting too close to it on purpose, threatening it or warning it off or protecting the rest of your group from whatever it is. If you're a manatee, you don't know what it is until you actually swim up to it and touch it. So in experiments with manatees, we find that these little pings actually attract them to the sound. So instead of keeping them away from whatever it was that was of concern to us, they're actually coming in and touching it and rubbing it over their sensory hairs and just generally behaving as though it were a friend. But that's not what it means. It means that they didn't know what it was until they touched it. So those are examples of 3 different species that react in very, very different ways. Now, your typical pinniped, which is seals and sea lions, avoids stuff when they don't know what it is, but they're very curious, because that's how they make a living. That's how they find things to eat, is by figuring out what things are. So they actually come up to the whatever it is that's making the sound after a while and check it out. If there's a fish anywhere near the sound, they immediately learn to associate that sound with something to eat. So as another example, when we release white sea bass from our aquaculture program, the Sustainable Seafood guys equip white sea bass with a little pinger. The pinger makes a sound, right? Because this is in the ocean. You can't use radio frequencies. You can't use light. You have to use sound. So the pinger makes a sound, the fish goes in the water and swims around. And then a few days later, the guys come back to me and say, we found the pinger on the bottom with a bunch of fish bones. Do you think a seal heard the sound and ate the fish? So again, another really good example of a situation where what the animal can hear is critical. So we asked the question of the seals, can you hear this sound? Technically, it's at the high end of their hearing range, so maybe they can't hear it, but you ask them. And in a series of experiments over at Wild Arctic at SeaWorld, sure enough, not only do they hear it, but even a really, really high-pitched little peep was enough to get their attention, and they avoided it. So initially, what does that mean? Does that mean that the fish scares them away? Well, no. Because they're really curious animals, and it only takes one try for them to realize, I'm not being harmed by this thing, so what is it? And now you've got the animal exploring, and the minute they find there's something to eat, it's a dinner bell. It's an instantaneous dinner bell.
So are these pingers being used, or is this kind of a trial?
Well, the type of pinger that we tested is actually in use in hundreds of thousands of fish and invertebrates, as part of experiments to figure out where they go and how long they live and things like that. But what we found is that in some areas where pinnipeds come close to where the instrumented animals are occurring, they're probably abnormally changing the mortality curves by actually taking the fish. So you got to think about what is really high enough to be outside the animal's hearing range. And that's an example of the kind of thing that we can find out with the experiments that we do.
So to wrap up, what are some of the things you're working on currently, or where would you like to see this go in the very near future?
Well, okay, so now that we have this information, great. As an example, for the manatees, what we need to do is take line like this that's really floppy. We know that if we put a pinger on it or something like that, that it's going to attract the manatee, so we can't use that. So what we need to do is come up with a way of making this harmless. One way is to make it stiff enough that the animal can't get itself entangled. we're talking about doing that. Another way is to make it so that the only time the buoy has to be at the surface is when the fisherman actually comes to get his gear. And that might actually be the safest way. So they're talking about technical solutions that actually make the buoy come to the surface. Our job is to test that out actually with the animal to figure out, yay or nay, what's going to work best for them.